So hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our ICNC Academic Webinar Series. My name is Steve Chase, and I'm the Manager of Academic Initiatives at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and I'll be the moderator for this webinar. Today, I'm really excited. We have with us Dr. Jonathan Pinckney, who has been a research fellow with the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and we've just published his new monograph called When Civil Resistance Succeeds, Building Democracy After Popular Nonviolent Uprisings. Jonathan's webinar will reflect on how movements can increase the potential of, after a successful civil resistance uprising against an authoritarian regime, but how do we create stable democratic governments afterwards? What can movements do to increase the chances of a really good outcome? It'll be about an hour in length, and it'll be in two separate portions. The first portion will be a presentation that will last about 30 minutes or so, with Jonathan speaking and showing slides for you. And then the final portion will be question and answer session in which you can ask your questions. During the presentation, you can minimize your control panel. You can do so by clicking the little red arrow at the top of your screen that points inward. Don't worry about background noise during the webinar, as all participants are muted except for me and Jonathan, so that won't interfere with the audio. Let's see. I'm having a little trouble switching the screens, and I want to do that for you. There we go. And so there's two ways to ask questions. The little hand right here that you can see can be clicked. And then if you have a microphone, or if you're doing this on a phone call, you could ask your question directly. And so I will see who's got their hands raised and ask, and then I will unmute you. If you don't want to be on air asking your question directly, you can type out your questions in this arrow down here to questions, and you can type them, and then I can read them. And then as we have time, we will be able to get your question and Jonathan's response. If we don't have time to cover everybody's questions, I'll write Jonathan and get answers to the remaining questions that are in the cache. And we'll post those on the website along with the recording of the video. And so this is just so you have a sense of who Jonathan is. There's the picture, and this is the cover of his new monograph, which is on the same topic as this webinar. And what I'm going to do now is change over the slideshow to Jonathan. And I just want to say, before I do that, a little bit more about him, though you've probably read this already on the webpage. But Dr. Jonathan Pinckney is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute of Sociology and Political Science at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. He's also an external associate of the Peace Research Institution of Oslo, and as I mentioned, he's been a research fellow at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. But rather than read out loud things that you can read for yourself, I will get you into Jonathan's presentation. Let's just change over the screen. And let's see if we, oops. There we go. Okay. Jonathan, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate being given the opportunity to share some of this work with you today. Thanks to ICNC for making this possible, both for providing some of the funding that went into the research that underlies both the monograph, which, as Steve mentioned, just came out, and what I'm going to be talking about today. My presentation today will follow fairly closely on the main topics that are covered in the monograph, and hopefully can be sort of a teaser for those of you who haven't had an opportunity to take a look at it yet, to dig in deeper into that work. So first, I'm going to start with an event which I imagine is very prominent in the minds of many of you today. And that is the 2011 Arab Spring, particularly in Egypt. Now, those of us who are interested in nonviolent resistance, of course, remember this as this moment of incredible hope, where we saw primarily peaceful change beginning in Tunisia and then later spreading around the region, ousting regimes that had been in place in many cases for several decades at a time. And in particular, this was happening, of course, in a region that many sort of scholars, policymakers, and activists had largely given up on. There was talk that, despite the fact that democracy seemed to be spreading across many parts of the world, the Middle East seemed to be uniquely resistant to it. And in 2011, of course, many of us were very optimistic that we were seeing that change. But of course, as we all know well now, over the following years, this moment of hope was followed by sort of moment after moment of frustration. And finally, of course, in Egypt in particular, we saw an event like this, which is, of course, the aftermath of the killing of hundreds of primarily peaceful protesters in Cairo's Rabaa Adawiya Square in 2013 after a military coup overthrew Egypt's first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi. And so this sort of dynamic over the few years of the Arab Spring really sparked this question for me that inspires this research project. And that is, why does nonviolent resistance sometimes lead to democracy and sometimes not? Because of course, in sort of some cases from the Arab Spring, primarily in Tunisia, we have seen the successful growth of democracy, and indeed in many other transitions across the history of nonviolent resistance, we see successful democratization. But in many other cases, we see outcomes like in Egypt. So why does this happen? And in addition to this, I was interested in the question of what we can do about it. Now, there's a school of thought in the scholarly literature on democratization that argues that the answer to this is that there isn't much, that democracy only really flourishes in countries that have a certain level of wealth, that have friendly neighbors, and a whole host of other sort of deep structural or cultural factors. But telling, say, an activist in Egypt in 2011, 2012 or so that, well, there's not much you can do about your country because you just have these unfavorable structural conditions, that's not really helpful. That doesn't really do much for us if, despite the constraints of structure, we want to move countries in a more democratic direction. So in this research, I really wanted to focus not on these sort of deep structural factors that may influence but are outside of the control of people who are going through these kinds of political transitions, but really focus on factors that people might be able to influence during political transitions. Now, a couple of quick definitions before I go through the research and what I found in regards to these questions. First is nonviolent resistance itself. I define nonviolent resistance as the application of political force outside the normal avenues of politics and without the use or threat of physical violence. And this is not a particularly original definition. This draws on much of what has already been written about nonviolent resistance in the literature. But just to clarify it for those of you who may not be as familiar, nonviolent resistance, as I'm talking about it, is a political action, something that involves force and coercion in an attempt to achieve a political goal. But it doesn't happen through sort of the normal ways of conducting politics. It's not a matter of simply, say, writing to an elected representative, but something that goes kind of beyond what is normally expected. But critically, that doesn't involve direct physical violence. Next, I'll be talking quite a bit about what I call civil resistance transitions. And these are political transitions, so that's the end of one political regime and the period of time before the establishment of a new political regime that have been initiated primarily by nonviolent civil resistance. So nonviolent resistance doesn't necessarily have to be the only factor that led to these transitions, but it did play a critically important role in initiating them. And in fact, civil resistance transitions have been quite common over the last 70 years or so during the post-World War II period, which is the period that I looked at in this research. Now, the map that hopefully all of you can see on your screens here shows in yellow every country that experienced at least one civil resistance transition from 1945, so the end of World War II, through to the Arab Spring in 2011. And this is a total of 78 political transitions spread across 64 total countries. Now, to understand which of these transitions tended to lead to more democracy and which did not, I had a two-stage research process. So in the first stage, I collected statistical data on this entire population of 78 transitions and did various forms of statistical analysis, some of which I'll be reporting back to you on in this presentation today. And then in addition to that, I did in-depth qualitative research in 3 cases that were very different from one another. So cases that were all civil resistance transitions, but other than that came from very different contexts and had very different outcomes. And so 3 cases I looked at were Brazil's transition away from military rule in 1984, Zambia's transition away from single-party rule in 1991, and Nepal's transition away from monarchy in 2006. And in all of these cases, I did an extensive look at the scholarly literature on them, as well as conducting interviews with activists, political leaders, and other important figures from the transitions. So, what was the result of this research? Well, the first important thing to emphasize, and this is in line with what many people before me have argued, is that nonviolent resistance does indeed have a strong democratizing impact. Out of those 78 political transitions initiated by nonviolent resistance, 60 ended in at least a minimal democracy. Now, of course, none of these regimes are perfect, and many of them still had major problems. But relative to other forms of political transition, say either violent revolution or a top-down liberalization process, this is a much higher level of democracy than the alternative. And this relationship continues to hold even if one takes into account possible favorable conditions that might encourage both nonviolent resistance and democratization. So the graph that, again, hopefully you can all see on your screens here, breaks down civil resistance transitions, shown in the blue bars, with all other political transitions, shown in the yellow bars, and then divided on the basis of whether the regime that they overthrew, so the regime that the transition came after, was extremely undemocratic, mostly undemocratic, or only slightly undemocratic. So basically with the sort of most repressive, most authoritarian regimes on the left-hand side there, and the least repressive, least authoritarian regimes on the right-hand side. And then the height of the bars indicates the percentage of those transitions that ended with at least a minimal democracy. And as you can see, even in the cases of extremely undemocratic past regimes, the civil resistance transitions ended in democracy around 80% of the time, while other forms of political transition only ended in democracy around 20% of the time. So in other words, it's very unlikely that you will see democratization after a very repressive, very authoritarian regime, unless that transition has been initiated through nonviolent resistance. However, of course, that still leaves us with this particular question that we started with. If this is the case, if nonviolent resistance does have this strong democratizing impact, why do we sometimes see it not obtaining? Why do we sometimes see either sort of minimally democratic or even full-on authoritarian regimes coming to power after nonviolent resistance transitions? And I identified two particular challenges, both, again, looking statistically at this whole population as well as the three particular cases. The first is maintaining social mobilization. Now, what I mean by this is that during the period of transition, the social and political engagement by civil society and ordinary citizens that has often been quite high during a civil resistance campaign needs to remain high. Now, this is quite difficult because people are often motivated to participate in a nonviolent resistance movement through sort of negative goals, what they want to get rid of rather than what they want positively for the future. And so once the old regime is gone, once the dictator has been ousted, once it seems like everything may be on a good track, oftentimes people tend to go home, and levels of social and political mobilization decline quite precipitously. And this is a problem because it provides space for, say, remnants of the old regime or other anti-democratic elements to hijack the transition and return things to a less democratic outcome. So that's that first. So the first challenge here, maintaining mobilization. The second challenge is in many ways the opposite or the mirror image of the first. And that's to avoid what in the monograph I call street radicalism. So in some cases, some civil resistance transitions, we see a problem of declining mobilization. In others, we do see a lot of mobilization, but that mobilization is directed towards breaking down new institutions rather than building new institutions. And if we're going to see the establishment of a sustainable new democratic regime, that mobilization needs to be directed towards building new institutional channels and regularizing methods of political engagement, turning the tools of nonviolent resistance away from breaking down political systems and instead towards supporting new channels of politics. And what I find when performing the statistical analysis of those 78 transitions from 1945 through 2011 is that indeed the transitions that are characterized by high mobilization and low street radicalism tend to end as democracies, whereas those characterized by low mobilization and high street radicalism tend to end as non-democracies. Now, and the graph that you can see on the right-hand side of your screens shows this. Happy to go into, in question and answer period, more detail about how I operationalize both mobilization and street radicalism, the particular kinds of variables I use to inform that. But basically what you can see here is a plot on the vertical axis. We have a country's level of mobilization during a political transition. On the horizontal axis, we have the level of street radicalism during the transition. And then the color indicates whether at the end of its transition, a country was a democracy or a non-democracy, with the democracies in yellow and the non-democracies in dark blue. And as you can see, the democracies tend to cluster on the top left-hand side of the graph, indicating that they have high levels of mobilization and low levels of street radicalism, whereas the non-democracies tend to cluster on the bottom right-hand side of the graph, indicating that they have low mobilization and high street radicalism. And again, happy to go into much more detail about where these numbers come from and what sort of specific indicators I'm looking at as people are curious. But this does seem to be a very strong and statistically significant pattern across the population of civil resistance transitions in the post-World War II period. So, having identified these patterns statistically, the next step in the monograph and in what I'm going to talk about today is to focus on what the specific lessons are that activists, political leaders, and others interested in these transitions can look at based on the particular cases that I examined in more detail. And I have 3 lessons about maintaining mobilization, 3 lessons about preventing street radicalism. So the first lesson on maintaining mobilization is to foster independent civic forces. And the crucial thing here is to maintain sources of popular accountability through which issue-based pro-democracy mobilization can be channeled. So oftentimes something that will happen in these transitions is that groups that have been previously in opposition, previously struggling against the regime, large segments of them now become the regime, enter positions of political power, which is a good thing, an important thing. But if everyone does this, if there aren't powerful independent forces that can continue to push in a democratizing direction, then this can be problematic. If we don't have independent forces standing up for democracy rather than the direct competition over power, then democratic progress often stalls. And this is illustrated quite well in the case of Nepal, where one civil society leader who I spoke to, who had participated in that country's 2006 movement against the monarchy, told me, "We had said our movement will go on until the constitution is framed. And when that happened, our colleagues, political parties, civil society, NGOs deserted us. And slowly the whole entire civil society forces became status quo oriented. Our wings were clipped. Groups that had previously pushed independently for a more democratic direction found themselves stymied during the transition, which has been problematic for Nepal's democratic progress." All right. Second lesson on maintaining mobilization is to keep new leaders accountable. Now, of course, many nonviolent resistance movements are often led by very heroic, almost legendary figures, people like Nelson Mandela or Lech Walesa, who ordinary people in these countries have a great deal of faith in. And there is oftentimes a sense that leaders who have gone through periods of struggle, who have been willing to sacrifice tremendous things for the sake of changing their countries, moving their countries in a democratic direction, once in power, will continue to push their countries in that positive democratic direction. And so there's a lot of faith, simply that all we need to do is to get the right people in power, and then everything will flow from there. And sadly, of course, this is simply not the case. As the old saying goes, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the leaders of civil resistance movements are no exception to this general trend. And the transition in Zambia provides a good example of these dynamics at work. This man here is Frederick Chiluba, who was Zambia's second president. Chiluba, as a trade union leader in the 1970s and 1980s, had been a prominent critic of Zambia's single-party authoritarian regime, and had indeed suffered quite a bit for the sake of his activism and speaking out against the abuses of that regime. And he had turned down lucrative positions of power and went to prison several times for advocating against the regime. This activism meant that in 1991, when a nonviolent resistance movement called the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy successfully overthrew Zambia's single-party authoritarian regime, Chiluba was their presidential candidate and became president of Zambia in that role. And again, a lot of faith that because of his history as an activist, because of his connection to the trade union movement, Chiluba would be a virtuous leader once in power. Sadly, this was not the case. The graph on the right-hand side of your screens shows the Varieties of Democracy Project's political corruption index for Zambia. And the period indicated by the vertical dashed yellow lines is 1991 to 2001, which is the period of Frederick Chiluba's presidency. which, as you can see on the graph, showed an explosion of political corruption. Once in power, Chiluba, quite famously, something that was reported to me by many different activists and political figures from Zambia, Chiluba famously said that he never knew that power could be so sweet, and very quickly began reaping a significant personal benefit from his position of political power, as well as suppressing political opposition. So very important that leaders of nonviolent resistance movements, no matter their potentially heroic history, are kept accountable once they enter positions of power. Third lesson on maintaining mobilization is to maintain a democratic vision. And as I mentioned, many nonviolent resistance movements are motivated by so-called negative coalitions. They're brought together around the goals of ousting or getting rid of a particularly hated dictator or regime. And this is a problem once we enter a transitional period, because of course, if people have only been hitting the streets, joining protests, getting engaged in politics because they want to end something, they won't be motivated to continue once the problem becomes building something new. And so to maintain mobilization, it's crucial to have a democratic vision that goes beyond simply getting rid of the old regime. And the political transition in Brazil in the 1980s provides a good example of this done well. So activists in Brazil who had been struggling against that country's military regime from the beginning had argued that getting rid of the military was only really a means to an end, that the end was a deeper transformation of society. And pursuing that deeper transformation kept activism going through the transitional period. As a Brazilian political scientist writes, popular movements believe that efforts should be maintained in order to avoid the demobilizing effects of the transition to transaction and to maximize the prospects of making a break with the past. Aspirations for a more just society could only be achieved if popular pressure and participation were exercised. So, 3 lessons on maintaining mobilization: foster independent civic forces, keep new leaders accountable, and maintain a democratic vision. So what about preventing street radicalism? Now, the first lesson is to avoid what I call extreme protest tactics. Now, nonviolent resistance is powerful, of course, in part because its tactics withdraw consent from existing power structures, disrupting the operation of normal social, political, and economic life. Now, of course, this makes it a very potent tool to break down oppressive political regimes. But in the context of a political transition, it often means that if nonviolent resistance in its most sort of extreme forms is maintained, it's impossible to have any kind of consistent progress towards building new political institutions. And the political transition in Nepal is a good example of this. Since 2006, when the nonviolent resistance movement ousted the monarchy in that country, political parties, civil society groups, ethnic groups, and others have frequently employed some of the most extreme tactics of nonviolent resistance, including blockades and general strikes. And just to highlight some of the effects of that, in a study in 2013 by a couple of economists at Nepal's central bank, determined that these general strikes had decreased annual GDP growth from 2008 to 2012 between 0.6 and 2.2 percentage points a year. And you can see that depicted in the graph on the left-hand side of your screen, where Nepal's actual rate of economic growth is on the solid blue line, and its potential rate of economic growth, had the general strikes not occurred, is in the top dashed dark blue line. And what's the effect of this? And the effect of this is that faith in democracy has been significantly undermined, both at a popular and at an elite level. Many ordinary people have lost confidence that the democratic political system can deliver development or other positive goods for them. because all they see is this consistent disruption by ostensibly democratizing forces. Even activists who had joined the nonviolent movement against the king in 2006 spoke to me about the need for a period of return to authoritarianism to end this political instability and get the economy on track. While tactics like, say, general strikes are extremely potent and shouldn't be ignored, in the context of a political transition, when not employed for sort of very broad civic ends, they can be deeply disruptive to the growth of democracy. Next, support new institutions. So directing political mobilization towards building new institutional structures rather than breaking institutional structures down. And Brazil, again, is a good example here. So as I mentioned, there was a great deal of mobilization during Brazil's transitional period, but this mobilization was mostly directed towards changing new institutional channels, in particular, Brazil's new constitution, which was passed in 1988, as you can see here. The Brazilian, in particular, the Brazilian constitutional process allowed for civil society groups to propose popular amendments to the constitution, of which ordinary groups proposed 122, many of which ended up in some form in the constitution, and which pushed the Brazilian transition in a more progressive democratic direction than had been previously anticipated, getting things like, for instance, a constitutionally guaranteed right to strike, universal health care through Brazil's unified health system, and measures to combat economic inequality, such as the expropriation of unproductive land, all achieved because mobilization was directed towards these new institutional channels. And the final lesson on preventing street radicalism is to not shut everyone from the old regime out. Now, there's a strong impulse, of course, in many of these transitions for a sharp break with the past and punishment for all those involved in the old regime. Now, of course, it is important, crucial for building legal accountability to punish past human rights abuses, but it's also important to create space for people from the old regime who have not been guilty of, say, severe human rights abuses to join the new political order. Otherwise, you create a strong force that is motivated to undermine democracy because they don't see any potential for them to legitimately enter the new political system. And political dynamics in the Zambian transition in the 1990s provide a good example of this lesson at work. So the picture that you see here on the right side of your screen is Kenneth Kaunda, who was the first president of Zambia and led Zambia during its period of single-party dictatorship. As I mentioned, Kaunda was ousted in 1991 by the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy. For a period of time, he left politics, but a few years later expressed a desire to re-enter democratic politics and compete for office once again. And of course, one can't know these things with 100% certainty, but by all accounts, his desire to enter the democratic political system seems to have been genuine. This wasn't an attempt, initially at least, to undermine the democratic political order, but simply to compete as another political figure. However, President Chiluba and the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy government were deeply opposed to this. They first began by using government resources to shut out Kaunda and his political party from political competition, for instance, by dispersing their rallies with police. And later, indeed, passed a constitutional amendment, which, while not explicitly naming him in its framing, was clearly intended to bar Kaunda from ever being able to become president once again. And the response by Kenneth Kaunda and his political party was to lose faith in the democratic process and to formulate what they called the zero option plan, which was a plan to create major political instability in Zambia to destabilize the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy's rule and return to power. When this plan was discovered, the MMD government created a state of emergency a significant rollback in civil liberties in Zambia, which has led to a pattern of politics today of all or nothing anti-democratic struggle between various forces. So 3 lessons on preventing street radicalism: avoiding extreme protest tactics, supporting new institutions, and not shutting everyone from the old regime out. Some brief thoughts on the potential role for external actors, for those who may not be going through one of these transitions, but may be looking from the outside. First important lesson is to honor local autonomy. That if we want independent civic forces to be maintaining mobilization, they need to be independent not just from local political actors, but from international actors as well. That movements will be most potent if they are well connected to the needs of people within their countries. There's a quote here from a Nepali civil society leader that I will just put up there for your perusal. In addition, it is important to help foster long-term strategic thinking in movements even before they have achieved success in ousting a non-democratic regime. As I mentioned when talking about the democratic vision of activists in Brazil, it was crucial that this long-term thinking about their vision of the future happened before the transition had started, when people were still mobilized to oust the old regime. So external actors may be able to help movements to begin that long-term thinking before transitions even begin. And finally, something that came up repeatedly in talking to activists and political leaders from these transitions was the importance of consistent, principled advocacy. That international actors could be most helpful when they were consistent and credible in advocating for, say, the protection of human rights principles like freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, as well as international law. So, final takeaway lessons, because I know I've run over half an hour now, and I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions and discussion. Nonviolent resistance is indeed a powerful democratizing force, as the previous literature has argued, but this force is not automatic. And to achieve more democratic outcomes, in part, we need to continue to have mobilization during political transitions and direct that mobilization away from street radicalism and to the building up of new political institutions. With that, thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Really appreciate you taking the time to explain that. So for folks who are listening, you remember there's 2 ways to raise questions, which is you can raise your hand and I will look and see that, and you could ask your question directly. Or you can type in the questions and I can read them off and have Jonathan respond. So I'll give people a little time to do that. We have one question already, which is, Jonathan, you coined the term street radicalism to talk about sort of splinter groups that aren't representing broad democratic goals, but are trying to, sort of impose their will on the rest of society, or at least block the goals of much of the rest of society. But there seems like this questioner is saying that there's sort of this tension between keeping people mobilized, holding leaders accountable, and so that there's times and places, even after a transition, where you would want to use civil resistance and nonviolent direct action. And so there was just sort of anything more you can help us understand sort of the distinction or the refinement around street radicalism of, like, when is it a good judgment to not just rely on normal institutional channels, but engage in civil resistance tactics for a particular campaign, and how can that be made to be useful in the transition versus destructive of a democratizing force?
That's an excellent question. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I completely agree with the questioner that sometimes during transitional periods, civil resistance and various forms of direct action are called for. I think the thing that I'm trying to emphasize in talking about street radicalism is to, I suppose, to think carefully and cautiously before engaging in that in the context of a transition. But there are definitely contexts in which it is called for. So say one that comes immediately to mind is, so the country of Burkina Faso has been recently going through a civil resistance transition. That country's longtime leader, Blaise Compaoré, was ousted in 2014. In 2015, some elements of the military attempted to stage a coup to basically to reverse the transition and restore an authoritarian government. And in response to that, there was there was widespread civil resistance by many of the same activists who had been part of that country's beginning the transition in 2014. And that was successful. They stopped the coup. The transition went back on track, and that country had a democratic election and are proceeding in a more democratic direction. And so that's an example in which I think in the context of a transition, the most extreme, the most radical kind of action would be called for when you have sort of a very clear threat to the country's democratic progress. But of course, the problem is that in many of these transitions, oftentimes it's not quite that clear, that you have significant disagreement between, say, the different factions of political parties or civil society that had come together to oust the old regime about what the new government should look like. And when it's more of that question, when it's a matter of what is the shape of our future going to look like, rather than a direct threat to democratic progress, then I think more caution is warranted. That people should think about how they can be building more constructive channels of institutional politics rather than relying on sort of more extreme direct action tactics. So there's no, I would say there's no sort of straightforward recipe. It really relies on the insight of activists and political leaders and ordinary people in countries that are going through these transitions to make those judgments about when the more extreme kinds of tactics are called for and when they're not. But that's sort of the general way that I think about it, and sort of the evidence that we see from the larger population of transitions.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. We have some people who have raised their hands that want to ask you a question directly. So the first person I'm going to unmute would be Rivera. So let's see. Yeah, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you so much. In the factors that you looked at that contributed to successful democratic outcomes, is there a hierarchy of importance to them, or are they all about equal in terms of what activists should be looking at?
Interesting question. Thank you so much for that, Rivera. I mean, I wouldn't say there is a clear hierarchy across the population of cases. If I would, in terms of sort of what seems to be more common, I would say the problem of demobilization seems to be more common across most transitions. Whereas street radicalism, while it does happen in many different cases, is not quite as universal a thing. So I would say it's very rare that you see a transition where there is no demobilizing pressure during the transitional period. So in terms of just what everyone can kind of be looking out for, I think demobilization would be something that I would focus on. But not as far as kind of thinking statistically about does one contribute more to democratic progress or not, I would say there isn't a real clear pattern there.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Now we have another live questioner from Olivia. I'll unmute you, Olivia. Go ahead. Oop, hang on, it didn't take. Okay, looks like you can ask your question now. It's possible she's no longer on. So another written question that we have is, let's see, what is the best way of holding new leaders accountable? Should we come up with a team of political experts to monitor them and remind them of their roles and duties in office they are occupying? So just sort of your thoughts from the case studies you've done, or what are some of the ways that people have used to hold people accountable?
Yeah, that is a really crucial question. I would say, I mean, I think there isn't a universal answer, that it will look different depending on the context of particular cases. I do think one thing to keep in mind is the structure of political institutions. You know, something that is not 100% of the time, but most of the time taking place during these political transitions is that, say, a new constitution is being written, new rules about sort of what the head of state and the head of government, what their level of power is going to be. These are things that are being decided during this period of time. And oftentimes, if you've had a sort of very charismatic leader who most people look up to, then there can be a sort of a bias, a push towards political rules and institutions in a new constitution that will give a president or prime minister greater power. And I would be very skeptical of those kinds of institutional structures, of pushing for more institutional checks and balances in any kind of institutional setup, and pushing more in that direction.
Excellent, thank you very much. We have another question here is, given your studies, what can you say about the role and influence of women-led, or where women are really included in the leadership and the organizing? Are there gender factors that are helpful in leading towards democracy?
This is such an important question and so crucial. And I have to unfortunately take a pass at this point because I haven't focused specifically on gender factors in this particular study. It's something that I think is really at the forefront of studying nonviolent resistance movements. Of course, we know in many cases that women play a crucial role in mobilizing nonviolent movements, in leading nonviolent movements, and in kind of maintaining and in continuing mobilization after the movement is passed. I haven't done sort of systematic looking into the effects on democratization of specifically having women in leadership roles. I have some hunches. I think it's probably quite positive because of the more general research on women in nonviolent resistance movements, and it's something that I'm hoping to look into more in future research.
Great. I'm been alerted that there's another person who wants to ask the question directly, so let's see if we can make this work. Okay, I may be mispronouncing this name, but Mara, I'm unmuting you. You are free to ask your question.
Hi, it's Maira.
Okay, thank you.
Can you guys hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you for your presentation. And my question is more sort of, I don't even know how to ask it. So let me explain myself. I'm from Brazil, and I know you use the Brazilian case to explain your presentation, and I'm not sure if you're aware of our election coming this week, this Sunday, and it's been, I've never seen something like this in the country. We have this guy called Bolsonaro. He's the preference of majority of the population right now, and he's completely like neo-fascist kind of person, like have made huge statements like, he would like to state a coup again, and he's pro-torture and against Black people and gays and activists. And it's just, it goes on and on and on. And the fact that we have a huge portion of the country supporting him, I think that few activists who work with me see this as a retrocess and a huge danger to fall back into an authoritarian government. And I just, honestly, I have used all the tactics I've learned as an activist, and none of it is working. I feel like people have been brainwashed so badly that it's the first time since we've been a democracy that a president don't go to the presidential debates. The guy refused to go to debates. He only states what he wants on his personal press, and the people that are choosing him are accepting that. It makes no sense to me. And they have made a huge influx of fake news to debunk the other guy running against him. And I don't know what possibly could be done, seeing the democracy that we fought so hard to be and to have threatened by a maniac. Honestly,
Mm,
that's how I feel.
mm,
And I'm not sure if you have insights on that. Because I've seen so many other countries going kind of like retrocessing and going backwards from um, what they've gained throughout years of civil resistance, and so many
mm,
countries who have this like wave of neo-fascist leaders coming out of the closet. And I just
mm.
honestly have no idea what else could be done.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I mean, I have been following the election in Brazil, and it is something that is very concerning to me. Everything I know about Mr. Bolsonaro appears to be, yeah, very troubling. Um, I mean, I don't know that I have any particular insights to share that you as an activist, I'm sure, don't already know. I think probably just to say that I'm with you, and I'm an American, and I have concerns about the state of democracy in my country as well, and I think we've got to keep doing everything we can to keep making our case for democracy, and yeah, stand together in solidarity as much as we can.
Thank you for the question and the response. These are challenging times. There is a lot of backsliding in countries that have fairly established formal democracies, and there's backsliding and electoral victories of pretty undemocratic forces. And teasing that out is clearly, we have other people here, another person from Brazil saying it's just terrible, and these are heart-rendering situations. Another question that I see here is, did you notice anything, or were you able to study, and maybe you can tell us a little more about how you studied this, but the person was wondering, are there distinct movement practices that beyond what you've said are sort of how they're organized. I'm guessing between very hierarchical civil resistance movements versus more decentralized. How do they build coherence? But were those factors something that you looked at and didn't find significant, or were they not looked at and they might be significant?
Yeah, great question. This is something that I'm actually working on right now. I'm part of a research project now called the Anatomy of Resistance Campaigns, where we're digging into sort of the particular organizations and groups that participate in nonviolent resistance movements, and trying to understand what the effects of different kinds of organizations are on, among other things, long-term democratization. This isn't something that prior to this I have done a lot of specific research on, though there is some great work from other scholars, people like Charles Butcher, who is also here at NTNU with me, that, for instance, the participation of labor unions and other sort of well-organized groups that have a connection to people's daily lives, when they participate in nonviolent resistance movements, that tends to encourage more democratic progress. So that's sort of one finding that we're digging into in more depth in our work now. I think it is, my suspicion is that when we look sort of more comprehensively, we will find a lot of movement practices, ways of organization, et cetera, that are important for democratic progress. But this is something that's really kind of at the cutting edge right now that we haven't dug into a lot so far.
Great, thank you very much. Well, we're getting close to the end of the time. One more question that somebody wrote in is how to get a copy of your report so they could look at the details, not only of your research, but to get a sense of the argument. And I can answer that. If you go to ICNC's website, you can download the whole monograph for free. So you would just go to our programs. It would list various programs. You would choose publications and then monographs, and you could get to Jonathan. You also can click from that web page and you can order a hard copy available that could be sent to you. That has a cost to it, but we try to keep costs low and just covering our costs. But those are the two ways that you can get it. I wanted to let people know that on November 15th, we will have another webinar, which is focused on the title of the webinar will be The Paradox of Repression and Nonviolent Movements, and that's based on a new anthology by Lester Kurtz and Lee Smithy on how repression from various regimes can be effective from the regime's point of view, but how it often isn't and leads to backfire and can strengthen movements. But very importantly, it's looking at what movements can do to increase the backfire effect and manage repression, which is something that's key to success with civil resistance. And also, given the democratic backsliding that we've discussed briefly, repression in even formally democratic countries is a big issue. And so want to let you know about that. It's at noon Eastern time, the same time as this one, on Thursday, November 15th. You can go to our website, look that up, and register for that. The other thing to let you know is that there's a short questionnaire after we're done with that will pop up for you, and we would like everybody who's on the call for the webinar to take the time. It doesn't take much time, but that'll give us some very useful information, and you would also have a chance to type in any questions that you might have additionally that we could send to Jonathan and then ultimately put on the web page. So thank you all for participating, and Jonathan, thank you for your hard work in doing this research and taking the time to present it to an international audience. So we thank you all and take care.
Thanks so much, Steve.
Bye.
Bye.